Every year, she rises. She says nothing, she offers no explanation, no mercy, and no negotiation. She simply lifts her hand, changes a number, and the world grows smaller. The people dissolve into red petals before the eyes of those who love them. Children become orphans. And the people of a city called Lumiere have spent 76 years watching it happen, sending expedition after expedition into a world they barely understand, hoping that someone, anyone, will find a way to make her stop. No one has, until now. My name is Vigil, and this is Video Game Lore. Today, we're diving deep into the full timeline and complete story of Clair Obscur Expedition 33, one of the most layered, emotionally devastating narratives in recent gaming. What begins as the story of a gifted painter in 1800s Paris becomes something far more profound, a story about grief, about the lengths a parent will go to hold on to what they have lost, and about a painted world full of people who never asked to exist, fighting and dying for a truth they were never meant to know. This is part 1 of 2. By the time we are done, you will understand not just what happened, but why. The fire that started it all, the family it destroyed, the world built inside a canvas to escape the following grief, and the 33rd expedition, the last one, that walked into all of it. This is where it begins. The known story of Clair Obscur's world begins sometime in the mid-1800s, in the city of Paris, France. A remarkably gifted painter by the name of Aline begins to rise to prominence, her talent setting her apart from those around her. From what the lore reveals, 2 influential and powerful factions exist within this world. The first are the writers, individuals undeniably gifted with the ability to shape and create entire worlds through the power of their words, though the full extent of their abilities has yet to be uncovered within the world of Clair Obscur. The second faction is that of the painters, who wield a force known as chroma, a power that allows them to bring their art to life directly from the canvas they work upon. It is Aline's exceptional chroma and mastery of her craft that ultimately earns her a place at the head of the Painters' Council. In time, she crosses paths with another painter named Revoir Dessendre, and the two eventually wed. During this period, Aline takes it upon herself to guide Revoir in harnessing his own chroma, helping him grow into a skilled and capable painter in his own right. Though no precise date is given, around the year 1877, a daughter named Clair Dessendre is born to them, followed by a son, Verso Dessendre, on February 22, 1879. As her children grow, Aline begins passing down her knowledge to them as well, for they too were born with the ability to use chroma. Clair proved to be a natural, sharp, disciplined, and quick to learn, eventually extending her talents into sculpting as well. Verso, while gifted in his own way, found himself drawn more to music than to painting, and was developing into a remarkably skilled piano player. Yet feeling the weight of expectation, to match not only Clair, but his accomplished parents as well, Verso did ultimately create a canvas world of his own. He filled it with fantastical beings, the first of which was Sciel, modeled after his beloved childhood stuffed creature. He also created the Gestrels, a race of beings built for combat, their forms a blend of paintbrushes and wooden mannequin models used in art to draw the human form. Among them, 2 were crafted as living tributes to the family's dogs, Monoco and Noco, and he gave rise to a race of towering, troll-like giants known as the Grandis. In the quiet moments between, Verso would venture into his canvas world, going on adventures alongside Sciel and eventually Monoco as well. In the year 1889, Alicia Dessendre came into the world, and like those before her, she was born with the ability to use chroma. Aline carried on the tradition she had established, guiding her youngest child in developing and refining that gift. While Clair continued to prove herself the most talented of the 3, over the course of the next 18 years, the Dessendre siblings would venture together into Verso's canvas, going on adventures among his many creations, all while Verso maintained the quiet facade of a young man contentedly pursuing his path as a painter. It can be assumed that tensions between the writer and painter factions was never far from the surface, though the lore doesn't tell us precisely when that friction erupted into open war. What is known that at some point in 1905, the writers found a way to reach Alicia, to communicate with her, and ultimately to manipulate her at only 16 years old. The exact nature of their persuasion and the role she was meant to play remains unclear, something we will be examining more closely in a future video. What is certain is that on December 23rd, 1905, a fire broke out. It spread quickly and without mercy, severely burning her face and costing her an eye. Verso, 26 years old at the time, rushed to her side and pulled her from the flames, but the fire claimed him before he could escape. His life ended at that moment. Verso's death fell upon the Dessendre family like a weight none of them were prepared to carry, and each of them began to grieve in their own way. Alicia, her face and throat left deeply scarred, her voice taken from her entirely, was left to recover in silence that went far beyond the physical. Renoir and Clair channeled the grief outward, turning their full attention to the war against the writers, driven now not only by duty, but by the need for vengeance. Aline, however, turned inward. She retreated into a deep and consuming depression, and in her darkest moments, she made sure that Alicia felt the weight of what had happened, reminding her, blaming her for Verso's death. With each passing day, Alicia grew quieter in every essence of the word, becoming little more than a ghost moving through the halls of her own home. Renoir did what he could to reach Aline, to offer some measure of comfort, but her grief had built walls he could not break through, not while a war still demanded his attention. The game does not tell us exactly how much time passed after the fire. Looking at the reconstruction taking place within the manor, it may have been only weeks, or it may have been several months, but at some point, Aline reached a place where her grief gave way to resolve. She did the only thing she believed she could to bring her son back. She took Verso's canvas, carried it to the atelier, and using her chroma, she stepped inside it. As a painter of formidable skill and power, Aline understood something fundamental about her craft, that a piece of every painter's soul is imprinted into their canvas. And it was within that truth that she found a reason to enter. Inside, she could be with her son again. Once within the canvas, she set her chroma to work, reshaping the world around her, adding to it a sprawling painted city she named Lumiere, a replica of Paris, rendered in the language of her art. The Lord does not tell us how much time passed, either within the canvas or in the world outside, a subject we will be examining in detail in a separate video. But during this time, she also painted human inhabitants to breathe life into the city streets. She then turned to something more personal, creating painted versions of her own family. For the purpose of this video, these will be referred to as Painted Renoir, Painted Alicia, Painted Clair, and Painted Verso. Each of these figures was granted immortality, shaped in the image of her family as she remembered and saw them, and each carried within them the memories of their real-world counterparts, believing, wholly and without question, that they were the real thing. Around this time, Renoir likely discovered that Aline had lost her position as head of the Painters' Council, her prolonged absence having cost her that standing. And though no specific timeline is given for how long she remained inside the canvas, Renoir eventually began to notice the signs, her life slowly fading. Aline had once pulled him back from the edge of losing himself in a canvas before, and he recognized what was happening. He ventured inside Verso's canvas with the intention of reaching her, of convincing her to leave before it was too late. What followed was not a quiet reunion. Tensions rose, words gave way to conflict, and a fight broke out between them. The chroma they unleashed against one another was staggering in its scale, so massive, so unrestrained, that the very world of the canvas shattered under the weight of it. The inhabitants would come to know this cataclysm as the fracture. The landscape was torn apart and remade. The heart of Lumiere was cast out to sea, now separated from a continent that bore little resemblance to what it had once been. Cities, villages, and the people and creatures that had called them home were either scattered to the far corners of the world or lost entirely. From the collision of their chroma, something else emerged, the Monolith, a towering, immovable manifestation of their deadlocked power, with Aline's chroma sealing Renoir beneath it, and Renoir's chroma holding her captive at its peak, and the number 100 now branded across its face. An account was recorded in Lumerian history. The tremors stopped, but it was hours before the dust cleared and we could see the sky again. Then I saw it, a jagged spire piercing the sky, 100 scrawled across its face, and at its base, an enormous statue of a woman. Author unknown, Monolith Year 100, Contemporaneous Accounts of the Fracture, Historical Records of Lumiere, Volume 1. Back in the real world, Clair became aware that both her mother and father had become trapped within the canvas. She made the decision to go after them, Upon entering, she found the Monolith and felt her parents' chroma, one above, one below. Knowing that she needed Revoir back in the real world to continue fighting the war against the Riders, Clair drew on her own considerable abilities as both a painter and a sculptor. Her knowledge ran deep, and her chroma, sharpened by years of discipline, nearly rivaled her mother's, perhaps even surpassed it. She observed that Revoir, weakened but still fighting, was attempting to use what little chroma remained to him to erase Aline's painted creations one by one, beginning with the oldest, as they were the most vulnerable to his diminished strength, while Aline fought against every erasure. Clair also noticed something critical. Whenever one of Aline's creations died, whether by accident or simply by passage of time, their chroma returned to Aline, replenishing her strength. The process of erasure, known as the Gommage, was far too slow on its own, so Clair chose to accelerate it. She created the Nevrons, warped, monstrous creatures drawn from her own sculptures and paintings, with new and terrible designs woven among them. She unleashed them upon the survivors scattered across the continent, and eventually upon the people of the now isolated Lumiere itself. The Nevrons were built with a singular, deliberate purpose. Upon bringing death to a human, rather than releasing chroma back into the world, they would trap it within their own petrified remains. In doing so, they cut off the flow of chroma returning to Aline, starving her of the very power that was keeping her strong. This process was now slowly and methodically beginning to weaken her. In the wake of the Nevron attacks on Lumiere, both Painted Revoir and Painted Verso brought forward plans to the Council for a protective dome, a structure that would shield the city from any future assault. As creations of the Paintress herself, both men had been granted immortality and imbued with vast reserves of chroma. They channeled that power into the construction of a massive shield dome around the now isolated island city, raising a barrier that would keep the Nevrons at bay. While work began on the metal lattice framework that would support the dome, Painted Renoir's thoughts turned to Aline. He and Painted Verso drafted plans for an expedition, one that would venture out beyond the city in search of other survivors of the fracture, and ultimately to find her. In the early days following the fracture, the population of Lumiere was still substantial, and the resources and collective strength needed for such an undertaking, while limited, were still within reach. The two men and the council assembled a formidable force, multiple large ships, a significant crew, and the ambition to mount one of the largest search and rescue expeditions the city had ever seen. As they departed, something unsettling occurred. A number of people, each of them around 100 years of age, vanished without explanation, leaving no trace behind. Expedition Zero made landfall on the dark shores of the continent and pressed forward on foot, navigating the landscape. Painted Verso moved ahead of the group, methodically laying ropes and grapple points as they worked their way toward the Monolith. When they finally reached the barrier surrounding it, they were met by a figure who was both familiar and deeply unsettling, the real-world Clair. She confronted them with the truth, explaining to the expeditioners exactly what they were and the nature of the reality they had been living in. When the members of Expedition Zero refused to turn back, Clair responded with the full force of her power. Commanding both her formidable chroma and an army of Nevrons, she systematically dismantled the expedition, wiping out nearly all of its members, save for a handful. Painted Verso and Painted Revoir, unaware of the full extent of the carnage left behind them, made their way back to Lumiere and attempted to relay what had happened, insisting to anyone that would listen that the Paintress was not the enemy. The council and much of the city were skeptical. With the two of them being the only survivors to return, their account was met with suspicion and doubt. The council dispatched 4 individuals, Julie, Claude, Louis, and Dion, to lead a new venture and uncover the truth for themselves. Painted Verso and Painted Revoir were permitted to join them as guides, their mission still operating under the designation of Expedition Zero. During the course of the journey, Julie witnessed Painted Verso sustain an injury that should have been fatal, one that no ordinary person could have survived. Painted Verso attempted to convince her that she was mistaken in what she had seen, but the damage was done. Fear that the two men were agents of the Paintress, and through the quiet manipulation of Painted Revoir, Verso made a devastating choice. He killed the remaining members of the expedition, including Julie, the woman he loved, to ensure that the secret of their immortality would not leave that place. Painted Revoir declared the course they would follow. Every future expedition that set out from Lumiere would have to be destroyed, not only to protect their secret, but to serve Aline's cause, ensuring that the chroma of the fallen would find its way back to her and tip the balance of power in her favor against the real Renoir. still bound beneath the monolith. When Julie and the others failed to return, the council concluded that sending further expeditions was too great a risk. Attention was redirected inward, toward completing the shield dome and advancing both their technologies and their understanding of chroma. For the next 15 years, life in Lumiere settled into an uneasy rhythm. Each year, the people would gather at the harbor to watch the Paintress rise up and change the number on the monolith. The Gommage continued its quiet work, unnoticed and unnamed, as the numbers counted down from 100 to 85. And each year, the elderly vanished without explanation, their disappearances mourned but not yet understood. That understanding came in Monolith year 85. The twins Anne and Gabrielle were at the harbor, as they often were, watching the Paintress make her ascent. And then, before the eyes of those gathered around them, they were gone, dissolved into dust and red petals. It was the moment that everything changed. For the first time, the people of Lumiere understood what the numbers had meant all along. This moment is captured for us in journal number 64, recorded by noted scholars Bridget N. and Jacques S., in a transcript from their lecture series titled The First Gommage and the Reshaping of Lumerian Society, dated Monolith year 64. It wasn't until Monolith year 85 that we finally understood. There had been disappearances before and wild rumors, but those were chalked up to grief and denial. Everyone knew someone who had walked into the sea. Our lands lost, our people separated, the unyielding waves of enemy, who hadn't contemplated the same. And for some, it was an act of love, knowing there were too many mouths to feed. But in 85, Lumiere finally bore witness. At the harbor, with everyone gathered to watch the Paintress rise, the elderly twins Anne and Gabrielle sitting on their usual bench as they did most mornings. And then, they were gone. The first recorded Gommage. That was the day we finally understood the meaning of the number she paints. The event shook the people of Lumiere to their core, filling the city with fear and a deep, unsettled dread. Faced with the undeniable truth of what the Paintress was doing, the council voted to resume the expeditions, this time not to search or to rescue, but to investigate and ultimately to destroy her. From that moment forward, over the course of the next 52 years, 52 more expeditions would venture out from Lumiere, each one carrying the same essential charge, to find a way to end the Paintress, or to lay the groundwork for those who would come after them. The full story of each of those expeditions, drawn from journal entries and environmental storytelling, will be covered in detail in a future video. The people of Lumiere, watching their loved ones dissolve into nothing with no end in sight, began to fracture. Most chose to honor those approaching the Gommage with ceremony and remembrance, but others took a far more extreme path, turning their grief and fear into devotion. A new faction emerged, one that worshipped the Paintress. In their eyes, the expeditions were not acts of courage, but of blasphemy, and the Gommage itself was divine punishment for daring to oppose her. Despite this growing divide within the city, the expeditions pressed on. But before the next chapter of that story could unfold, an event was about to take place in the real world, one that would shape the canvas and everything within it, for better or for worse. In the real world, during what corresponded with Monolith year 49 inside the canvas, Alicia awakened in the Dessendre manor. She was called down to the atelier by her sister Clair. What she found there stopped her cold. Both Revoir and Aline stood frozen in place, locked in their ongoing battle within the canvas, one driving the Gommage forward, the other fighting to hold it back. Clair stepped in from beside the canvas, her eyes carrying the unmistakable look of someone who had just returned from inside it. She told Alicia plainly that their parents were still fighting, and that for now, the two of them remained at a stalemate. Alicia voiced her concern over how long they had been in there. Clair dismissed it, reminding her that they had spent far longer inside other canvases before. Their father, she said, was wasting his efforts trying to help a woman who did not want to be helped, when the real-world war against the Riders was demanding his attention. With a coldness that barely concealed her exhaustion, Clair stated that if Aline wanted to trap herself inside the canvas, then Revoir should let her. Grief, she said, was no excuse. Aline had abandoned her responsibilities, and the Painters' Council had stripped her of her position because of it. Alicia asked if there was anything Clair could do to help Revoir. Clair told her she had already done her part. The Nevrons she had created were tipping the scales in her father's favor. As Aline grew weaker, Revoir was gaining the ability to erase her old creations through the Gommage. All of them, save for the painted Dessendre family, who had been granted immortality and remained beyond his reach. Clair then made clear that she had more pressing matters to attend to. The writers were gaining the upper hand, and if the painters were to survive, she had tasks that could not wait. Alicia said she wanted to help. Clair looked at her and called her weak. She reminded her, without softening it, of how the writers had used her, how they had manipulated her into starting the fire that had cost their family everything. She told Alicia she could not promise to protect her if they found a way to use her again. And then, with a grief she could not fully conceal, she said she both loved and hated Verso for sacrificing himself to save Alicia the first time. If Alicia truly wanted to help, Clair told her, she should enter the canvas and help Revoir to end the stalemate so he could come back. She needed him in the real world as she would rather not fight alone. Alicia, before doing anything else, hid the canvas, ensuring their mother would not be able to find her way back to it. Clair, upon learning this, acknowledged it was the right call. Then Alicia stepped inside, but her inexperience betrayed her almost immediately. Aline's chroma, vast and pervasive, overwhelmed her before she could find her footing, and her mother began to paint over her. Clair attempted to intervene, but quickly saw that the effort was futile. She made the only decision left available to her. She told Alicia that she would be reborn inside the canvas as one of Aline's creations. At the very least, she said, Alicia couldn't cause any more trouble in that state while Clair was gone. And so Alicia was repainted. Every memory of who she was stripped away. She was placed as an embryo within a married woman living in Lumiere, in Monolith year 49. The pregnancy came as a surprise to the couple, but when the child arrived, both parents welcomed her with joy. They named her Maelle. During this time, Clair made her way back into the canvas to find painted Verso. She told him what had happened and had asked him to watch over the child. He agreed, and over the next 16 years of Maelle's painted life, he would slip into Lumiere in secret to check on her. When Maelle was 3 years old, her parents were taken by the Gommage in Monolith year 45, leaving her among the many orphans the Gommage had created. She passed through several foster homes over the years until, around the age of 11, a man named Gustave and his sister Emma became her legal guardians. She would spend the years that followed apprenticing under Gustave until the main events of the game began in Monolith year 33. The day of the Gommage had arrived. Gustave stood alone in a garden, holding a single red flower for Sophie, the woman he had once loved, and in many ways still did. The two of them had parted ways over a disagreement that cut to the heart of what it meant to live in a dying world. Whether bringing children into it was an act of hope or cruelty, their love had never fully disappeared. Before he could dwell on it too long, Maelle appeared, offering him a bit of light-hearted teasing before reminding him he was supposed to be helping with the festival. The two of them made their way across the rooftops of Lumiere, working in a quick sparring match to burn off Maelle's relentlessness. When their skirmish was done, Maelle sent him off with a farewell as Gustave descended into the streets below and made his way to Sophie. He asked to walk with her to the harbor, to spend whatever time the day allowed. He offered her the red flower, and he added it to the ceremonial wreath she was already wearing. They walked slowly, talking of things past and present, stopping to speak with various citizens of Lumiere along the way. Before they reached the harbor, Sophie paused and said something quiet, that she felt a measure of sadness for the paintress. She said if you looked closely enough, she seemed sorrowful, that she was probably caught in the same cycle as the rest of them, unable to escape it. They reached the harbor at last, where Gustave's apprentices were waiting. They handed him his expeditionary uniform, and wasted no time poking fun at the two of them for being still so clearly drawn to one another. The children told him they would see him at the festival before running off to find their place for the ceremony. Gustave asked Sophie why she had helped prepare his uniform. She told him simply that she wanted to see him wearing it. He changed into it, and together they walked to the edge of the harbor. The crowd gathered in silence, each person carrying their own quiet weight. Some stood with their eyes fixed on the monolith, hoping the paintress would not rise. Others had already made their peace with what was coming. Then the sky darkened. The paintress began to ascend, and with a sweep of her hand she erased the number 34 from the year before and painted in its place the number 33. The realization swept across Sophie's face like a wave, and then it began. Everyone who had reached the age of 33 or older dissolved, pulled apart into red petals that drifted and faded from the world. Gustave held on to Sophie's hands with everything he had, until there was nothing left to hold. He sank to his knee as the sun continued its descent. Later that evening, Gustave arrived at the festival held for the expeditioners of Expedition 33. There were fewer tables than in years past, fewer people willing to volunteer with each passing year, though still more than Expedition 34 had managed the year before. Lucien, Catherine, Leo, Tom, who was working on perfecting his own pictos, Sciel, Seba, Mikel, Alexandra, Raphael, Jerome, Alan, the Expeditioner's commander, Lune, who had managed to triangulate Expedition Zero's original landing point so they could begin from the same ground, Tristan, who had helped calibrate Gustave's Lumina converter, a device that would allow its user to internalize and draw upon more than just 3 pictos at a time, as well as Maelle and many others whose names we do not come to know. He ended his rounds with his apprentices, who pressed a journal into his hands and asked him to document everything. Then, his sister Emma arrived. As chief counselor of Lumiere, she carried the full weight of the city on her shoulders, and she did not hide it. She reminded him of the difficult realities surrounding the expeditions, that while they lifted the spirits of the people, she personally believed they accomplished little more than sending more lives to their end. She asked him to stay, to keep contributing his engineering and scientific mind to the city's survival. Gustave looked at her steadily and told her she would manage everything just fine without him. He was going to do something that would give all of them a real future, not just another year of survival. She relented, and before she let him go, she asked him to look after Maelle, even as she admitted she wished Maelle wasn't going either. Emma took the stage, and her voice carried out across the harbor as she delivered her address to the expeditioners. As her speech continued, the scene changes to the next day, as the expeditioners made their final preparations. At the harbor, crowds had gathered to send them off, cheering, calling out to them, watching as they boarded and dispersed into the mist that separated Lumiere from the continent beyond. The ship made landfall on the dark shores. As the expeditioners disembarked, a figure emerged slowly from the mist, painted Revoir, moving toward them with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done this before. The expedition commander Aline stepped forward to confront him, demanding to know how a man his age could still be standing. The answer came without words. With a single swift strike of his cane, painted Revoir took Aline's head. The expeditioners stood frozen for a fraction of a second before chaos broke loose. They fell back, retreating under the relentless assault from both painted Revoir and the Nevrons known as the Noir, who tore through the group with devastating efficiency. Painted Revoir driving the slaughter to return their chroma to the Paintress, the Noir moving to trap whatever remained within themselves. In the midst of the carnage, an explosion threw both Maelle and Gustave to the ground. As Gustave fought to hold on to consciousness, he caught a glimpse through the smoke and confusion, a man, who we would later come to know as Painted Verso, lifting Maelle from the ground and vanishing with her into the dark. Lucien pulled Gustave to his feet, and the two of them passed behind a cluster of large rocks, trying to regroup and make for the indigo tree rally point. It was not enough. Noir closed in, and one by one they took Lucien, Margot, and Tristan. Then, the Noir turned its attention to Gustave. The explosion that followed swallowed everything, and the world went dark. Gustave came to at the edge of a waterfall, at the threshold of the spring meadows. He gathered himself, took in his surroundings, and pressed forward down the path. He encountered a Nevron and dispatched it alone, then pushed deeper until the path led him into a dark cave. What he found inside stopped him cold. The bodies of expeditioners filled the space, not only from his own, but from those who had come before. All of them petrified, their chroma sealed within them, preserved in the stillness of stone. Among them, he spotted Catherine, not yet petrified, run through by a spear of a Nevron, her chroma still her own. Gustave, defeated and utterly alone, lowered himself to the ground beside her. He summoned his gun and raised it to his head. Then Lune's voice reached him. She spoke plainly and without sentiment, cutting through the darkness with the kind of honesty that leaves no room for argument, and she convinced him to keep going. Together, they were set upon by a massive Nevron, and together, they brought it down. In the aftermath, Lune suggested he test the Lumina converter on it. It worked. For a brief moment, despite everything surrounding them, there was something close to relief. Lune then proposed they make for the indigo tree. If anyone else had survived, that was where they would be. They were nearly there when a flare arced into the sky above them. They pushed toward it and arrived to find Leo alive, running for his life. Gustave and Lune moved to reach him, but they were too late. A massive Nevron called an Avec struck before they could intervene, and Leo was gone. The creature then turned on them, cutting off any chance of retreat and forcing the fight. They held their ground, wore it down, and finally brought the Avec down. They climbed to the top of the indigo tree. Carved into the bark in red was the number 33, and beneath it a message. Took Maelle to the weird corals. Head north, look for a door inside the hut. The two of them stood with that for a moment before the debate began. Wait at the rally point as protocol demanded, or go after Maelle. For Gustave, there was no real debate. She was as much his daughter as she was his sister, and he told Lune plainly that he would be heading north with or without her. Lune reluctantly went with him. They made their way to the flying waters and began searching. After pushing through several Nevron encounters, they found the hut. As Gustave moved to enter, Lune noted that someone was actually living there. They called out and stepped inside, though neither of them knew that painted Verso was watching from a distance as they crossed the threshold. Inside was a faithful representation of the Dessendre manor. While Lune took in the details of the space around her, Gustave called out for Maelle. They followed the sound of movement and found her in a room, seated at a desk, already working on an expedition journal. The relief between them was immediate and wordless. They crossed the room and held on to each other. Maelle told them that she remembered the beach, and nothing after that until she woke up in the manor. Before they could press further, a deteriorating, faceless figure drifted into the room, a being known only as the curator. Maelle was quick to reassure them. The curator had been helping her, she said, and had even reinforced all of her pictos. Lune studied him carefully, trying to determine what exactly he was. The curator turned to leave without offering an answer. They met him again in the hall, where he put them through a brief training exchange before agreeing to meet them back at camp. The three of them stepped out of the manor together. A rumbling shook the ground nearby, and then a small gestural named Monoco came bursting out from behind a wall of rocks. Lune stared, visibly caught off guard. The gestuals were supposed to be a myth, and yet here one was. She muttered that if gestuals were real, then perhaps Grandis and Esquier were real as well. Maelle mentioned that the gestural village was not far from their current position. Gustave reminded them that reaching the Paintress had to remain their priority, but Monoco cut in with a hard truth. There was no way to reach her without first finding a means to cross the vast stretch of sea that separated the continent from the Paintress. Maelle asked if Monoco knew how such a crossing might be made. He suggested that the gestural chief, Golgra, would have the answer. He told them to pass through the sanctuary and make for the main gestural village. Lune made no effort to hide her enthusiasm at the prospect of meeting more gestrals, and with that, the group set off toward the village. That night at camp, sleep brought Maelle no peace. In her nightmare, she found herself looking at a camp consumed by fire. Julie came running towards the blaze, then fell to her knees as the bodies of her comrades lay at the feet of a man standing in the dark. Painted Verso turned to face her, his expression twisted with fury. Julie rose with her sword drawn, ready to meet whatever came next, and then the scene shifted. Maelle was on her knees, clutching a ribbon soaked in blood, screaming at the monolith standing before her. She jolted awake at camp. Gustave was already there. He asked if she was alright. She told him she was fine. After a moment, she admitted that she thought she was used to death by now. But out here on the continent, it felt different. Harder, more immediate. Gustave sat with her and told her plainly, if death came for them in any form, and especially if painted Revoir came near, she needed to run, as far and as fast as she could. She agreed, but only if he made her the same promise. Gustave, in the way only he could, agreed with a lightness that cut through the weight of the moment. The two of them made their way back to the fire and settled in for what rest the night would allow, while the curator kept his silent watch over the camp. When they reached the gestural village and introduced themselves to Golgra, she got straight to the point. Esquier, she told them, was the one who could get them across the sea, but the guard at the path to his nest, a gestural named Suniso, would not let them through without the password. Golgra made it clear that she had no intention of handing it over freely. If they wanted it, they would have to compete in her tournament. They agreed with varying degrees of reluctance, as Golgra remarked with some amusement that watching them face the stranger should be entertaining. They made their way to the arena, registered, and fought their way through a series of opponents. When the time came to face the reigning champion, the stranger, the figure that entered the arena did so with considerable flair. Maelle and Gustave recognized the face immediately. It was Sciel. She was just as relieved to see them as they were to see her, and the reunion was immediate and genuine. Lune began to ask how she ended up in the village, but the arena announcer cut her off. The fight had to begin. When it was over and Sciel had been defeated, The group gathered outside to pick up where they had left off. Sciel told them that she had come to in a yellow forest, where a gestural had eventually guided her to the village. Believing herself to be the only survivor, she had decided to spend whatever time remained before her Gommage doing the one thing she could, fighting in the arena. Lune pulled them back to the matter at hand, and they all went together to collect the password from Golgra. Golgra congratulated them on their victory and delivered the password with characteristic bluntness. To get past Siniso and reach Sciel's nest, they needed to say, "Get out of my way!" And they had to mean it, she added. They had to yell it as loud as they possibly could. She told them not to die too soon, and Gustave thanked her before leading the group out toward the nest. Back at camp that evening, as the group talked through their next steps, Maelle was quiet. Something was pulling at her from somewhere she couldn't name. Another vision took hold. This time, she saw painted Alicia standing before her, the lower half of her face concealed behind a cracked porcelain mask that covered the burn scars beneath. The two of them moved slowly towards each other. Painted Alicia reached out, her hand rising towards Maelle's face, and then Painted Renoir stepped in. He told her she should have stayed home. Painted Alicia turned on him, pointing at Maelle with unmistakable anger. Painted Renoir acknowledged it. He told Painted Alicia that yes, it was Maelle's fault, and that she had no idea that it was. But that changed nothing. She needed to leave. Maelle, disoriented and shaken, demanded to know what was happening. Painted Renoir told her she should not have come, that her presence was only making things worse for everyone around her. He made himself clear. This was his final warning. She and her companions should turn back and spend what little time they had left in peace. Maelle moved to strike and snapped back into reality. The vision was gone. The others moved to her side as the confusion and distress she had been holding back began to break through. They stayed with her until the moment passed and eventually made the decision to rest and set out for Sciel's nest at first light. The expeditioners arrived at Sciel's nest and found themselves face to face with the gestural Siniso, who informed them plainly that no one passed without the password. Sciel nominated Gustave to deliver it, then reminded him, with some emphasis, that he needed to yell it. He did, with visible reluctance. Siniso's response was not what any of them expected. He told Gustave he didn't have to be rude to him, the large gestural said, wounded. And for the record, Golgra had never actually given him a password to begin with. The others let Gustave have that moment before they moved past a flustered Siniso and made their way into the nest. They climbed the stairs and emerged at the edge of a vast pool of water that shimmered like a natural hot spring. The calm lasted only a moment before Sciel came streaking in from above and plunged into the water with tremendous enthusiasm. He surfaced and greeted them warmly. Sciel returned the greeting, and Sciel lit up with recognition. He called her his terrible swimmer friend, with the kind of fondness that suggested a story worth telling. Before anyone could ask about it, Gustave steered them back on course. They were trying to reach the Paintress, he told Sciel, and Golgra had said he was the one that could get them there. Sciel explained that to carry them across the sea, he would need his rock, a particular one named Flory, to help them make the crossing. He directed them next door to his friend and sworn arch-nemesis, Francois, who currently had it. They exchanged a look, agreed, and headed next door. Inside, a large rock turtle bellowed at them the moment they entered. They asked for the rock. Francois refused and made it clear that the only way they were getting it was through a fight. They obliged him. After a hard-fought exchange, Francois relented and handed it over, grumbling as he did. They brought it back to Sciel, who took one look at it and knew immediately that something was wrong. It was not Flory. From next door, the sound of Francois laughing carried through the walls. Flory, he informed them with great satisfaction, was at the Stone Wave Cliffs. Sciel, undeterred, told them that if they could bring him Flory, and if they were willing to gather the rest of his rocks as well, he could carry all of them to the Paintress. He added, with a note of something quieter beneath the enthusiasm, that with all of his rocks together, he could even fly them, just as he used to do with his best friend Verso. The group agreed without hesitation. Sciel told them to head north to reach the cliffs, then launched himself skyward and was gone. They made their way out of the nest, set up camp, and prepared to move at first light. That night, the nightmares found Maelle again. She stood surrounded by familiar faces, holding a slice of cake with a small Lumiere Eiffel Tower candle burning at its center. The monolith loomed behind them, bearing the number 33. One by one, everyone around her began to Gommage. Everyone except her. Then the scene shifted. She saw painted Verso holding Julie aloft, his sword run through her chest. He lowered her gently to the ground, his face covered in blood. The image dissolved into another, painted Verso and painted Alicia standing before the monolith, the number 100 carved into it, as he placed his arm around her. Then came the flashes, a room in the Dessendre manner, engulfed in flames. Verso standing inside the fire, slowly turning to look at her, reaching out, his hand stained red. She woke and made her way to the edge of the cliff, throwing rocks into the dark below, something she and Gustave had always done to see how far they were from the Paintress. When he found her and asked how she was holding up, she told him that the people from her earlier dream had felt like they knew her. She told him that life in Lumiere had never made much sense, but that out here on the continent, things were beginning to feel stranger still, and heavier. Gustave told her he understood. He said that in those moments, anchoring herself to what she did understand was what would carry her through. Then he told her, with genuine warmth, that he was glad they were all back together. Maelle laughed and told him that might have been a little too cheesy. He admitted it probably was. The two of them talked and laughed as the night settled around them, and eventually made their way back to get some rest. While Maelle slept, two figures stood over her in the quiet of camp, painted Renoir and painted Alicia, side by side, watching her breathe. Painted Renoir gestured toward her, and painted Alicia stepped closer. She spoke softly, almost to herself, saying that she envied those that were ignorant of the world. Maelle had no memory of who she truly was, no knowledge of the sins that had shaped her, and she slept in that blissful unawareness. Painted Alicia, by contrast, had been created with those very sins woven into her, forced to carry the memory of them, no way to set them down. She stood there for a long moment, then turned and embraced painted Renoir. He held her, and then, without a word, the two of them disappeared back into the dark. The following morning, they set out into the stone-waved cliffs in search of Flory. They fought through wave after wave of Nevrons, navigating the winding labyrinth of stone pathways until the trail led them to the mouth of a dark cave. Sciel told them he could sense Flory somewhere within, but that he could also sense something else in there. Something that frightened him. The expeditioners headed inside regardless. As they moved deeper, hundreds of lanterns began to ignite along the path, one after another, lighting their path toward the far end of the cave. What waited for them was a massive Nevron, a towering construction of arms and hands, each one clutching a lantern, known as the Lamp Master. Gustave told the others that the rock was close, but the Nevron had to be dealt with first. They threw everything they had at it, and after a brutal fight, they sent it crashing through the cave wall and down into the rocky waves below. Maelle remarked that the fight hadn't been so bad. Gustave told her not to jinx it. Lune scanned the area and said she couldn't find Flory anywhere. Then, the ground began to shake. The Lamp Master erupted back out of the water and came at them again. They dug deep and fought it a second time, and once more sent it plummeting off the cliffside. Exhausted and barely standing, they began to search the area. Sciel found the rock, picked it up, and handed it to Sciel, who dove into the water below and called up for them to jump on. Sciel and Lune leapt down first. Maelle and Gustave lingered for a moment on the cliff's edge. Gustave said quietly that the Paintress didn't seem quite so far away anymore. Maelle suggested that they throw one more rock at the monolith first, just to be thorough. As Gustave bent down to gather the right stones, a presence moved in behind them. Painted Renoir approached with the slow, deliberate certainty of someone who had never once been in a hurry. Gustave was mid-sentence, trying to explain in his usual manner the particular art of choosing the right rock, when a blast of chroma punched through his chest. He stumbled. His blood sprayed across Maelle's face. She froze. Gustave struggled to keep his footing and told her to run. She moved towards him instead. Painted Renoir raised a barrier of chroma around her, sealing her in place, keeping her from reaching him. Maelle screamed at Gustave to run. He shook his head. He turned to face Painted Renoir, and through the pain, asked him why he was doing this. Painted Renoir said nothing. He kept walking forward. Gustave, jaw set, summoned his weapons and went at him. He threw everything he had, volley after volley, strike after strike. None of it made any difference. Gustave told him they should be on the same side. Painted Renoir regarded him with a quiet, cold smile and kept coming. Down below, Sciel and Lune began to sense that something was wrong, but before they could move to help, the Lamp Master surfaced once more and forced them back into the fight. With no other options left, Gustave channeled every last reserve of power in his mechanical arm into a single overcharge attack at full force. The blast caught Painted Renoir off guard and drove him hard into the cave wall. The arm, completely spent, fell from Gustave's shoulder. He turned to look at Maelle, and for just a moment, his expression was calm. Then he turned back and watched Painted Grimoire pull himself upright, entirely unharmed, his immortality already having done its work. Gustave understood what that meant. He looked back at Maelle, and with a quiet resolve of a man who already made his decision, he said the words every expeditioner carried with him, for those who come after. Maelle told him he had promised to run. He turned away from her, drew his weapon one final time, and charged. Painted Grimoire vanished and reappeared in an instant, and delivered the final blow that ended it. Gustave went silent. Maelle's grief shattered the chroma barrier containing her. She ran to him and collapsed over him, and the sound that came out of her was not a word. It was something older and rawer than that. Painted Grimoire stood over them both and told her that what he was about to do was a kindness. He struck her with a blast of chroma that expelled her essence from her body entirely. In that suspended state, she became aware of a conversation she was not meant to hear. Aline's voice shaken, asking how Grimoire could have let her come, knowing the risks. Grimoire's voice, measured and cutting, saying that unless something was directly in front of Aline, she never cared enough to act. Then, directed at Maelle, she was supposed to have stayed home. For now, he told her, she needed to stay put and wait for it to be over. Aline cut in, sharp and urgent, telling her she needed to leave. Grimoire's voice returned, steadier. When it was finished, he said they would all go home together. Aline's response was a single word, fierce and absolute. No. Maelle slammed back into her body. A shockwave of chroma staggered Painted Grimoire where he stood. He recovered and loomed over her, explaining with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this many times that he only wanted what was best for both of their families, and that he had given her every warning he could. He raised his hand to finish it. Painted Verso stepped between them. He caught his father's strike and held it. Painted Grimoire regarded him with something between recognition and resignation, and said it had been a long time. Painted Verso glanced at Maelle with an expression that was unmistakably fond. His father told him to stay out of it, that after everything, after all this time, he did not get to simply walk back in and interfere. Painted Verso told him he had lived long enough, that it was time to let go. Painted Grimoire's voice dropped into something quieter and more painful. A lifetime, he said, spent with his family broken and incomplete. He wanted that time back. Painted Verso reminded him, gently but without wavering, that this was not truly his family. But Painted Alicia was. He turned to Maelle and asked if she was all right, then told her to get back to her friends. Maelle dropped down to SKA below. Painted Grimoire watched her go, then turned back to his son and asked if he understood what he had just chosen, and what it would cost him. Painted Verso looked out toward the monolith, standing in the distance above the water, and said simply that she would never paint again. Back at camp, Maelle's grief came out in a torrent, anger and frustration and tears all at once, with nowhere left to put any of it. SKA made his way over to her and offered what he could, a hug. Maelle accepted it without hesitation, holding on to the comfort it offered. Nearby, Lune and Sciel sat by the fire, speaking quietly. They noted that the last time the two of them had been together like this, gathered in the early morning hours, it had been for their parents' expedition. It seemed that every time they found themselves in the same place, it was to grieve something. Lune pulled herself back from that thought and steadied her voice. They needed to stick to the plan, she said. The Paintress had to be stopped. They had lost the Lumina converter, but Expedition 32 would be bringing more supplies. There was still a path forward, still a chance to succeed where others had not. Sciel placed a hand on her and told her gently that tomorrow would still come. There was no use of carrying the weight of it tonight. Painted Verso stepped into the light of the camp, pausing for a moment to look at the curator, who returned his gaze in the same unreadable silence he always kept. The sound of approaching footsteps brought both Lune and Sciel to their feet. Then Painted Verso moved towards Lune and Sciel and held out Gustave's mechanical arm. It had looked important, he said, so he brought it back. He told them that heading north through the rock quarry would take them to the monolith. The questions came quickly after that. They wanted to know who he was, where he'd come from, what he wanted. He offered his apologies first, that he had not been able to save Gustave. When they pressed him on the expedition uniform he was wearing, he told them plainly that he was an expeditioner, and that he had been a part of Expedition Zero. They asked how he had avoided the Gommage, how he could still look so young. Painted Verso deflected with a careful vagueness saying only that some of them had simply stopped aging. He told them that the man who had killed Gustave was their commander. They asked how Revoir could turn on his own people. Painted Verso chose his words with precision, leaving out the deeper truth. He told them that Painter Revoir believed his immortality had been a gift from the Paintress, and that he was convinced if she were destroyed, he would lose it. He had simply decided, a long time ago, that he had no interest in dying. Painted Verso then said something quieter, that he had grown tired of watching everyone around him die while he remained, that unlike his commander, he had never found much comfort in living forever. He told them that he wanted to help them destroy the Paintress. Maelle, who had been listening from a few steps away, walked forward. Killing the Paintress meant getting her revenge on Painted Revoir. That was reason enough for her. She was in. She asked him his name. He told her it was Verso. After that, Painted Verso was given a moment he had not expected, a reunion with Sciel. Brief in the way that old friendships sometimes are, carrying more weight than anything that could be said aloud. When it had passed, the group settled down and let the night be quiet for a while before the journey continued. The next morning, Painted Verso found Maelle at the cliff's edge, throwing rocks at the monolith in the distance. He asked if Gustave had been her brother. She said something to that effect and kept throwing. He tried to comfort her, He tried to offer comfort. She told him she was tired of condolences, that she had lost enough family in her life, and that she wanted him to leave her alone. He respected it and walked away. As he went, he set Gustave's journal quietly on a rock where she could find it. They broke camp and made their way to the entrance of the rock quarry, a place the maps called the Forgotten Battlefield. What none of them knew was that somewhere within its depths, a particularly neverous Nevron called the Duelist still moved through the wreckage, threading its way between the bodies of fallen expeditioners and Grandis alike. Sciel carried them to the southern entrance and set them down. What greeted them was difficult to take in, a vast field of petrified expeditioners, preserved in the stillness of stone as far as the eye could see. Painted Verso told them that they would get used to it. There was more ahead. Before they could press forward, Maelle stopped them. She was clutching Gustave's mechanical arm. She asked if they could bury him. Lune pushed back. They needed to keep moving. Sciel said they could find a place along the way. Painted Verso told them he knew of somewhere on the other side of the forest, a quiet and beautiful stretch of ground where he had laid others to rest before. It was enough to get them moving. As they moved through the quarry, the sheer scale of the loss around them was staggering. Painted Verso told them that most of what they were seeing had been the work of a single Nevron. They asked if it was still out there. He said he believed it was gone. He hadn't seen it in some time. They fought through what Nevrons remained and eventually reached the stone bridge at the quarry's far end. Partway across, Painted Verso asked Maelle how she was holding up. What came out of her was not an answer. It was everything she had been holding back. She told them that all they ever saw was death, everywhere they went, and that she couldn't take it anymore. She turned on Painted Verso and said she had thought, of all people, he might understand what it felt like, given how long he had been forced to watch the world lose people. She turned on Sciel and told her she was acting as though Gustave hadn't just died. Sciel held steady and told her they had to go on. She quoted the Expeditioner's Creed, "When one falls, we continue." The words had barely settled when the shadow of the Duelist fell across them from above. It had been watching. It drew its sword and dropped onto the bridge, and the stone gave way beneath them, sending all of them plunging into the chasm below. They landed in a pool of blood. Around them, thousands of fallen expeditioners were piled in the dark, the accumulated dead of decades of failed attempts. Painted Verso was on his feet first, standing between the others and the Duelist as they recovered. Lune moved quickly to heal Maelle, and then the four of them faced the Nevron together. They fought hard and without hesitation, and eventually brought it down. When it was over, Painted Verso remarked that it had not been as formidable as its reputation suggested, and offered genuine praise to Maelle for how quickly she had grown in the fight. Lune placed a hand on Maelle's shoulder and turned her toward the stack of bodies surrounding them. She told her quietly that this, all of this, was what they were fighting for. The four of them climbed out of the chasm and made their way north until they reached a red tree, surrounded by grave markers that Painted Verso had placed there himself over the years. Maelle set his mechanical arm on top of the grave. Each of them said what they needed to say. Promises to carry on, gratitude for everything he had been to them, words that would never be enough and were offered anyway. Then they gathered themselves and walked out through the north exit of the rock quarry. That night at camp, Painted Verso laid out the path ahead. He told them that their next destination was Monoco's station, where they could recruit his oldest friend, someone they would need if they were going to take down the Paintress heart. Sciel asked why the heart specifically. He explained that the chroma surrounding the Paintress had grown so dense it had formed a barrier. Anyone who came close was erased on the spot. Destroying the heart would bring that barrier down. Lune asked where the heart was located. He told her it was somewhere in old Lumiere. The reaction from both Sciel and Lune was immediate, so the stories had been true. Their city had once been a part of something larger, something that existed on the continent before the fracture tore it all apart. Painted Verso confirmed it. He told them he had been with Expedition 58 when they discovered old Lumiere, and that Painted Remoir had arrived and erased them before anything could come of it. Lune said the plan made sense. They agreed on it, and the group dispersed for the evening. Painted Verso moved through the camp, taking time to speak with each of them, asking questions, listening, learning who they were. Later, Maelle found her way over to him, and the two of them talked about grief and sorrow with the kind of honesty that only comes when people have stopped pretending. At some point, Maelle caught herself and made light of the two of them sitting there wallowing together in the dark. Then, she reached into her things and held out an Expedition 33 armband. She told him he was one of them now, and welcomed him to what she called the Disaster Expedition. Painted Verso looked at it for a moment, then accepted it. He was smiling when he did. The two of them turned in for the night. The four of them arrived at Monoco station and stopped to take it in. The remains of actual trains sat in various states of ruin around them, a relic of something that had once connected the entire continent. Painted Verso told him as much, that the lines had run everywhere before the fracture ended all of it. As they made their way inside, Lune's attention was pulled immediately to the side of a Grandis moving through the station. Another myth confirmed, standing right in front of her. Before she could fully process it, something came at them from above. A white, hairy masked gestural, wielding a stick with a bell attached to the end, launched an attack on the group. Painted Verso stepped in and blocked it without breaking stride, and told the attacker he was still slow. A moment later, Esquier came soaring in, shouting, "Momo!" as the gestural rounded on Painted Verso and demanded to know if he had dragged him into another one of his adventures. Lune asked how it was possible that he could speak their language. Painted Verso told her he had taught him, and introduced him as Monoco. Monoco, apparently satisfied with the introductions, immediately offered the three women a duel. Painted Verso told them to humor him. A good fight was the quickest way to settle him down. They accepted, and after besting him in combat, the reunion was cut short by Noco's voice ringing out an alarm. A Nevron was coming. Noco also asked where Gustave was. Painted Verso redirected the conversation before anyone could answer. Noco told them the Nevron, a creature called a Stalact, was bearing down on the station, and that every Grandis in the area had already gone into hiding. They went out to meet it. Monoco announced with complete seriousness that they could all prove their worth by bringing the Stalact down. The others looked at him. Painted Verso confirmed that he meant it. They went in and dispatched the massive Nevron with focused efficiency. Monoco declared them worthy, and then, without ceremony, reached down and tore the foot from the Stalact's body. He briefly took on the Stalact's form himself, before adding the foot to what was apparently an existing collection. As Painted Verso explained to the others, that Monoco had the ability to use the feet of defeated Nevrons and make use of their abilities. Monoco then asked why they had come. Painted Verso told him they were heading to old Lumiere. Monoco refused immediately. Painted Verso acknowledged that their last attempt had ended in failure, and then turned and pointed at Maelle. He asked Monoco if he recognized her. Monoco said that he did. Painted Verso said that was precisely why this time was different, why they had a real chance. Monoco told him flatly that he was never joining him again. Painted Verso mentioned, almost as an aside, that there would be a great deal of fighting involved. Monoco agreed to come without another word. With the group now complete, the expedition set out from the station and began the journey toward old Lumiere. That night, they made camp, and while the others gathered around the fire, Painted Verso and Monoco stepped away to the edge of a cliff to catch up in private. Monoco asked why everyone seemed so heavy with grief. Painted Verso told them that they had lost people along the way, more than a few. Monoco thought about it and then suggested that Painted Verso try what he called Verso magic to lift their spirits. Painted Verso looked at him for a moment, then reluctantly agreed. Monoco grabbed him and tore him cleanly in half. Painted Verso's lower half walked itself over to the fire and greeted the expeditioners. Every one of them was on their feet in an instant, staring in stunned belief. He kept his tone light, making easy conversation as though nothing unusual was happening, while his torso came crawling up behind to rejoin the group. The questions came fast. He answered them with the same ease and humor, steering the mood deliberately, working to get them to laugh. From the darkness at the cliff's edge, Monoco watched. He muttered to himself that Painted Verso had just put himself through genuine pain for the sole purpose of making them smile, and that he was beginning to worry his old friend was growing too attached to these people. Eventually the laughter settled, and the camp grew quiet, and they all got what rest they could before the next leg of their journey began. The 5 of them entered what remained of old Lumiere. The city was in ruin, broken and silent, its streets cracked and overgrown, its buildings hollowed out by time and the violence of the fracture. Sciel stood for a moment taking it in, remarking that Lumiere had once been part of all of this, until the fracture sent it out to sea. Luné admitted that in hindsight, that had probably been the only reason any of them had survived. They pressed deeper into the city until a massive structure blocked the path forward. Painted Verso told him the heart of the Paintress was at the center of the city, and then turned to Monoco and told him to show off. Monoco transformed into a stalactite and drove through the building, which promptly exploded, scattering the group in every direction. Luné and Sciel came to in the rubble to find Monoco crying and apologizing for what he had done. Sciel steadied him and told him it was alright. They just needed to reach the city center, and they would find Painted Verso, Maelle, and Noco there. The 3 of them made their way through the broken streets, turning over the great unanswered questions of their past as they went. At some point, they came across one of Esquier's rocks. Sciel asked Luné why she had agreed so readily to Verso's plan, whether she actually trusted him. Luné said their interests were aligned, for now. Sciel said she had a feeling that he was hiding something. They asked Monoco how he and Painted Verso had first met. Monoco became vague, said he couldn't quite remember, and left it at that. He mentioned they had worked alongside quite a few expeditioners over the years, and continued to deflect whenever the details were pressed. Then, Luné stopped in front of a massive fallen figure. A giant female form collapsed in the street. She asked what it was. Monoco said he had never been to old Lumiere before and had no answer for her. Luné looked down and found the bodies of some of Expedition 58's members nearby, in the journal they had left behind. She began reading through it. She said they had made it remarkably far, and that the fallen giant was referred to in the journal as an Axon called the Hauler. Then, something in the pages made her go quiet. She looked up at Monoco and asked if what she had just read about Painted Verso was true. Monoco said nothing. The silence was answer enough. Luné and Sciel exchanged a look and decided they needed to find Maelle, now. In another part of the city, Maelle was pulling herself up from the broken ground. Painted Verso and Noco were already there. He helped her to her feet and told her the others were making their way to the city center. They would all meet there. Maelle looked around at the ruined streets and said the place felt like home. Painted Verso agreed, and there was something in the way he said it that carried more weight than the words themselves. They moved through the city together as Maelle asked him questions about his time in their Lumiere, the one she had grown up in. Eventually, they came across 2 Nevrons and dispatched them without much difficulty. Maelle noted they made a good team. When she turned to say it, Painted Verso was gone. Noco told her not to worry. He disappeared all the time. He always came back. The 2 of them pressed on until they came to an old manor. Maelle slowed as she approached it. She said it felt familiar, that she knew this place somehow, though she could not have said why. She walked up to the large front doors. They began to open on their own. From within the darkness of the estate, the Paintress emerged, moving slowly toward her, though Maelle did not yet understand what she was looking at. Painted Verso arrived and cut the moment short. He said he had known the Paintress would open the door for Maelle, and moved immediately to press the advantage, rushing in to attack. A blast of chroma stopped him cold and sent him stumbling back. Painted Grimoire stepped out from the shadows, regarding the situation with calm disapproval, and asked if this was really the best plan Painted Verso had managed to come up with. Painted Alicia appeared beside the Paintress. The Paintress then retreated behind the manor doors and sealed them shut, leaving Maelle and Painted Verso alone to face Painted Grimoire. He asked his son why he kept doing this, why he kept hunting them. Painted Verso told them not to lecture him. Painted Grimoire said that everything he had ever done was for the family, while Painted Verso kept throwing himself toward death. Painted Verso told him that he was doing it for himself. Painted Renoir replied that if casting him as the villain made it easier, then so be it. Maelle stepped forward and told Painted Verso she was going to kill this man. Painted Renoir looked at his son with quiet disappointment and asked if he still hadn't told her the truth, then addressed him directly, calling him son. Before anything else could be said, a bolt of lightning came streaking in. Painted Renoir deflected it without effort, as Lune, Sciel, and Monoco arrived to join them. Lune turned on Painted Verso immediately, demanding to know whether he had been planning to tell them that the man who had slaughtered their expedition was his father. Painted Verso said it was not his favorite subject and moved on. Painted Renoir had heard enough. He brought his cane down hard, and Painted Verso told the group that he would very much like for them to survive what was coming. The fight began. They gave everything they had, and it was enough to make Painted Renoir stumble, but only just. He recovered, raised his cane, and gathered a vast and terrible amount of chroma before unleashing it on all of them. Monoco threw himself in front of Noco. When the dust and light faded, the group pulled themselves up one by one. Painted Verso asked if everyone was alright. They looked towards Monoco. He was standing with Noco's lifeless body cradled in his arms. Maelle turned to Painted Renoir with everything left in her and attacked. Every strike dissolved harmlessly against his chroma. He looked down at her and asked with a weariness that bordered on contempt why she could not simply accept who she was. He moved to put her down. Painted Verso stepped between them, and something broke open in him, his emotions crashing through before he could stop them. And the name that came out of his mouth was not Maelle. He shouted, "Alicia, move." He caught his father's strike and held it, and for a moment, everything went still. Maelle looked around. Painted Alicia was stepping out from the manor. The two of them moved towards each other, drawn by something Maelle could not name. Painted Alicia reached up and removed her mask. Beneath it were the burn scars she had carried since the fire. She took hold of Maelle's arm, and the contact sent a rush of images through Maelle's mind. The manor burning, flames climbing the walls, everything consumed. Maelle asked for her name. Painted Alicia looked at her for a long moment, then replaced her mask, turned, and walked back inside the manor. The moment she crossed the threshold, the estate vanished, teleported away from the city, and Painted Renoir with it. Painted Verso stared at the empty space where the manor had stood, caught off guard by his sister's interference in a way he hadn't anticipated. The confusion hardened quickly into something else. They gathered what they had left and walked out of the ruins of old Lumiere and made camp without much being said. Back at camp, Sciel fed Flory to Esquier, who thanked her warmly. Lune wasted no time and turned to Painted Verso, telling him to explain himself. He said he did not think of Painted Renoir as his father, and that he had not told them because it was none of their business. Lune told him plainly that regardless of the circumstances, it was still a lie. Sciel stepped in and reminded all of them that they were a team now, and that trust was the only thing that would get any of them through what was ahead. Maelle said simply that family was complicated. The tension was interrupted by Monoco, arriving with little Noco secured inside a gestural container. Lune asked if it was true that gestrals could reincarnate. Monoco told her he could partially bring Noco back, but that he would not remember everything from his previous life, that in most ways, he would be a different Noco. Painted Verso told Monoco he was sorry, and that it had all been for nothing. The Paintress's heart was gone. They had lost their shot. Lune told them that Expedition 58's journal had mentioned him saying there was another way. Painted Verso said he had not been hiding it. He had simply dismissed it as a dead end. Lune said there was someone else who might be able to help. She stood up and led them over to the curator. She asked the curator directly, could he build a weapon capable of breaking the barrier? And if so, did he need something from the Axons? The curator repeated the word back to her. Axons. Axons. She asked if he needed their hearts. Painted Verso told them that the hearts of Axons contained enormous concentrations of chroma, more than enough to power what they needed, but that obtaining one was impossible. Maelle asked what the Axons actually were. He told her they were massive creatures living on an island surrounding the Monolith, far more dangerous than any Nevron they had encountered. He said that even with his immortality, he had never once managed to defeat one. Lune brought up the dead Axon they had found in old Lumiere. Painted Verso said he had no explanation for how it had died, but that they needed to be reasonable about this. The odds of successfully killing one were as close to zero and made no difference. Lune told him that close to zero was not zero, that they still had a chance, and that either way, their deaths were already coming for them. She said she would rather meet hers fighting. As they turned to leave the curator, Painted Verso told them that if they were going to attempt it, They should go after the one to the west of the Monolith first. It had already been weakened by previous expeditions. Sciel said with a mocking grin that they should challenge themselves properly and kill the eastern one first. Monoco told her he admired that. They spent the rest of the evening talking through strategy and getting to know one another a little better before settling in for the night. The next morning, they set out for the island to the west, Sage Island. As they made their way into its interior, Monoco referred to the Axon that called this island home as he who hides truth with lies. Sciel took note of the vast sea of faces carved into the island's stone surfaces. Then a roar rolled across the island, deep and resonant, announcing the Axon's presence. One of its many masts descended toward them, examining them, sizing them up. It felt less like a threat and more like an invitation. Painted Verso said it was a trap. Maelle said at least it was a straightforward path for once. Then, a figure appeared before them, the Mask Keeper, who told them calmly that they had no need for their weapons, that he meant them no harm. The others remained wary. The Mask Keeper told them that Visage extended an invitation to join him. Sciel asked where the other paths on the island led. He told them to explore as they wished, that masks were meant to illuminate, and that they should find the ones they needed. The invitation would remain open. He then left them in peace to decide. They chose to walk the other paths first. The first led them through a passage representing joy and happiness. At its end, they faced and destroyed the mask embodying that emotion. When they returned to the island's center, they understood. Each mask they destroyed was weakening the Axon itself. They followed the same path through sadness and then through anger, fighting and destroying the mask that represented each one. When they judged it had been weakened enough, they climbed to the top of the island to confront Visage directly. The sky turned red as they arrived. Visage materialized before them and summoned a mask, setting it on the ground between them. Sciel picked it up. It pulled her into a trance almost immediately, but she fought through it and hurled it back at Visage, which was apparently not part of the plan. Enraged, the Axon attacked. The battle was brutal and sustained, but they brought Visage down. Before they could leave, they found themselves standing before the Mask Keeper once more. He told them that everyone wanted to know what lay behind the mask, and that great art was both a window and a mirror, regardless of whose mask it was. Sciel looked at him and understood. The Mask Keeper was the real Axon. He acknowledged it and told them that everyone needed masks, but how they used them was a choice. Then the real fight began. It was harder and more vicious than anything before it, but they wore him down and finally struck him to the ground. In his last desperate act, he cried out that they all needed masks and covered every face in the group with one. Everyone except Monoco, who was already wearing his own. The mask turned on the expeditioners immediately, pressing into their minds with a force that was difficult to resist. Everyone except Sciel. She pushed back against it, tore the mask from her own face, and said plainly that it could not hurt her, because it was her. She reached out and ripped the mask from the Mask Keeper himself. The blow knocked him down and shattered the hold on the others. The Axon was defeated. The heart, the mask, was theirs. Painted Verso did not follow the others when they turned to leave. He stood and watched as the Axon's chroma began to fade and dissipate. Something in the pattern of it stopped him. He studied it, and slowly the recognition settled in. The Axon had been a representation of the real Verso, and the hand that had shaped it had been the real Renoir's. He stood with that knowledge for a moment, and then walked back to join the others. They returned to camp as night fell, and made their way to the curator. Back at camp, Lune moved to hand the mask to the curator. He paused, and then gestured, not towards himself, but toward Maelle, indicating that she should be the one to give it to him. Lune accepted this without argument. The moment Maelle placed the mask in the curator's hands, a flash cut through her mind. The real Renoir, vivid and immediate, there and gone in an instant. She tried to describe what she had seen. Painted Verso stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on the curator, his expression tightening as the realization of what the curator was trying to do settled over him. Maelle said the name out loud, Renoir. Painted Verso moved quickly to dismiss it, saying that Renoir haunted his mind as well, and that it meant nothing. The curator held his gaze on Maelle for a long, still moment. Then, they all drifted back toward the fire. The evening passed with conversation and the kind of quiet bonding that comes from people who have been through too much together, and eventually the camp grew still. The next morning, they set out for the eastern island to claim the second Axon heart they had needed. When they arrived, Lune noted the architecture looked unlike anything they had seen before. Monoco told her that was because the island had not existed before the fracture. It was something that had been made in the aftermath. As they approached the vast open chasm at the heart of the structure, they saw her. The Axon called Siren moved through the space in a slow, sweeping dance, her voice rising and falling in song that seemed to fill the air itself. She sent out miniature versions of herself, creatures called ballet, and they began to dance around them, drawing them under her spell immediately. Monoco spoke her name quietly, Siren, she who plays with wonder. One by one, the others continued to fall deeper in a trance, a pull at the edges of their thoughts, something soft and disorienting pressing in. Monoco recognized it and told them she was manipulating their emotions, that they needed to focus. He rang his bell sharply, and the sound cut through the spell and brought them back. He told them that what she really did was get inside people's heads. Painted Verso urged them forward, and they pressed deeper into the structure, fighting through creatures that moved within it until they reached the center and came face to face with the Axon herself. As they approached, Lune found herself momentarily arrested by the sheer scale and grace of what stood before them. Maelle said quietly that she was certain she had seen the way Siren moved before, that the dance felt familiar in a way she could not explain. They kept moving. Siren felt them coming and intensified her performance, and the spell began to take hold again, deeper this time. She leaned in close to each of them in turn, peering into something beneath the surface, into their memories, into the losses they carried, and she pulled those images out and held them up. Lune's parents, Sciel's husband and child, Maelle with Gustave, Monoco and Noco. She turned her attention to Painted Verso. It found no purchase. Nothing came. Siren drew back, and what crossed her face was something close to anger. She swept the vision away, and the fight began. The battle was relentless and full of danger, but the expeditioners held their ground and pushed through everything she threw at them. As her defeat became inevitable, Siren gathered what remained of her power and drove it into one final, desperate attempt to break them. She extended her hand toward the group. Lune stepped onto it. Siren began to lift her slowly toward her face, drawing her in, but Lune held onto herself. She fought through the haze closing around her mind, pulled herself back to the surface, and released a massive blast of chroma directly into Siren. The force of it shattered the hold she had over all of them. Siren began to fade. As she dissolved, she left behind a large cut of cloth, her heart. They gathered it and turned to leave, making their way back to the camp and to the curator. Back at camp, Maelle stepped forward and presented Siren's heart to the curator. The moment it left her hands, time stopped. The woman from the manor stood before her, the paintress herself, reaching out toward her. Maelle asked who she was. The woman recoiled and lashed out at her. The curator pulled Maelle back into the present. The others asked what she had seen. All she could describe was a woman, and she stood there wondering why these visions kept finding her and what they meant. Then, something shifted in her. She turned and faced the curator directly and demanded to know who he was. The curator did not answer with words. He turned and drew on the chroma of both Axon hearts simultaneously, channeling it into the creation of a single weapon, a sword. The barrier breaker. He held it out toward Maelle. The others gathered around her, each of them offering their quiet encouragement, and she looked at every one of them before reaching out and taking it into her hands. The evening that followed was unhurried. With the weapon made and the path ahead finally clear, they gave themselves the time to simply be together, sharing more of themselves than they had before, trusting each other with things they had kept close. As they sat around the fire, the weight of what they had accomplished began to settle in. They had the means to reach the Paintress. They had a real chance to break the cycle. Then Sciel, clearly enjoying herself, announced that Sciel had told her about Painted Verso's secret stash of wine, hidden inside of him apparently. For a fraction of a second, Painted Verso's expression shifted, as though bracing for an entirely different secret to come out. When he realized it was just the wine, he recovered smoothly, told them to enjoy their drinks, and drifted away from the fire toward the cliff's edge. The monolith stood in the distance, closer now than it had ever been, and he stood looking at it in silence. Painted Alicia appeared behind him. The two of them stood together without speaking for a moment, the quiet between them carrying the weight of everything they had never needed to say out loud. Then she held out a sealed letter. On the back of the envelope, written in French, were the words, "Une vie à rêver," a life to dream, or a life worth dreaming. Painted Verso took it and nodded. He tucked it into his pocket, and then slowly reached up and began to remove her mask. He told her that his beautiful sister had no need for one. They held each other for a brief moment. Then, Painted Renoir arrived. He stood at the edge of the firelight and said he had found it strange, his son embracing her while at the same time condemning her to die. Painted Verso asked his sister if she had brought their father. She shook her head, firmly and without hesitation. Painted Renoir told his son he had not come to fight. He asked instead whether Painted Verso truly understood what it meant to be erased, not defeated, not wounded, but gone forever, with nothing left behind. He asked whether he had considered what that meant for their family, for the new friends he had gathered around himself. He asked who was painting life and who was painting death, and whether Painted Verso genuinely wanted to throw away the gift of eternal life they had been given. He said that despair had blinded him, and asked whether he was truly prepared to pay the price for himself and for everyone around him. Painted Verso looked at his father a long moment, and then said simply that everything would be decided in the shadow of the monolith. He turned and walked back to the fire. The camp settled into quiet, and one by one they let the night take them, carrying the weight of what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, Esquier carried them through the water to the barrier. Lune took the sword first and tested it carefully, satisfying herself that it was ready. Then she placed it into Maelle's hands and stepped back, letting her do the honors. Maelle hesitated for just a moment before driving the blade into the barrier. It took effort, a brief but real struggle, and then the barrier split open, and the final path to the monolith lay before them. And that is where we leave it for part 1. From a gifted painter rising to prominence in 1800s Paris, to a family torn apart by fire and grief, to a painted world built from loss, and finally to the dark shores, where Expedition 33 took its first steps into a continent that had been waiting to swallow them whole. We have covered a great deal of ground today, and the story is only half told. Part 2 arrives next week, and I promise you, it does not slow down. The truth behind the curator, the confrontation at the monolith, the fate of the paintress, and a choice at the end of it all that will determine whether this world lives or dies. It is coming, and you do not want to miss it. If you have enjoyed what we have built together in this first part, if this world has pulled you in the way it pulled me, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story worth telling. Subscribe if you have not already, and make sure you hit the notification bell as part 2 finds you the moment it drops. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, which part of the story we covered today hit you the hardest? Was it the fire that started it all? Gustave's final stand on the cliffs? The moment Painted Verso stepped between Maelle and his father? Let me know. This community is what makes this worth doing. This has been Vigil, and this is Video Game Lore, and I will see you all in part 2.